Ankita Sethi, Research Scholar, Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi, welcome you all to the final session of second day of National Webinar on Multidisciplinary Approaches to Folk Life, Challenges and Perspectives. Today we have amongst us Professor Debarshi Nath. Before I request Sir to begin his lecture, I would like to briefly introduce him to the audience. Professor Nath is the head Department of Cultural Studies, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Tejpur University. He has many achievements to his credit, and apart from being an erudite scholar in field of cultural studies as well as English literature, he has effectively managed various projects by CPEPA and MHRD, and he has worked for documenting, preserving, and archiving rare cultural resources of Northeast India. He has 8 books to his literary oeuvre and numerous research papers published and presented in national and international journals and conferences. His research area includes, but is not limited to, cultural theory, contemporary culture, comparative literature and translation, cultural memory and history. And today he'll be talking on creativity and traditional cultural expressions. These 2 initial days of webinar have already helped us to expand the horizon of our understanding of this discourse of folklore and folk life. And Professor Nath's lecture will help us delve deeper into this realm. And when I say this, I am not just anticipating, but I feel privileged that I had the chance of meeting him during my stay at Tejpur University in 2018 for a research methodology workshop. And I had the chance of witnessing his erudition. So also before I welcome Sir, I would request the audience to put their questions, comments and observations in the chat box so that when Professor Nath concludes his lecture in 40 minutes, we can have a further discussion. Professor Nath, I am so very pleased to welcome you, sir. All of us are eagerly awaiting your lecture. So over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ankita, for the kind words. Just one small correction. In fact, I have just handed over headship to one of my colleagues in the department from January this year. So I'm no longer the head of the Department of Cultural Studies. But anyway, thank you so much for the kind words. And also let me thank the organizers at the beginning, particularly Professor Patnaik, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on what I believe is an interesting topic of creativity and traditional cultural expression. So thank you all. Now, as we are aware, traditional cultural expressions refer to verbal expressions such as folk tales or proverbs and riddles. They could be musical expressions such as folk songs, expressions by action such as folk dances and artistic forms of ritual, which may or may not be given a material form or tangible expression. So traditional cultural expressions may include any artistic or traditional expressions. It may be tangible or intangible, and these could be the results of individual or communal creativity, and they are generally the characteristics of a community's cultural and social identity and cultural heritage, and they are maintained, used, or developed by such a community. Now, this will be a talk on creativity and traditional cultural expressions, but I choose not to begin with a definition of creativity because that is what I thought we should all begin by doubting, by raising questions about. I'm sure that we all understand what we mean by creativity or what creativity entails. I want to begin by talking about ways in which our understanding of creativity has undergone change. I aim to do this because I plan to develop a critic of the commonsensical understanding of creativity. I believe that there is a need to incorporate with the concept of creativity a folk understanding of it. Now, creativity has generally come to be viewed as a special characteristic which some individuals possess more than others, unfortunately. And this manner of thinking about creativity implies a belief that some individuals are creative while others are not. But I think the folk or the traditional point of view regarding creativity tends to be much more democratic and much more egalitarian than this. Traditionally, in Indian societies, we did have such a view. We used to believe, at least in the past, that all individuals are creative. And creativity is not the exclusive characteristic of some people or of some individuals. And in this belief system, say for instance, a folk dancer was considered to be as creative as a craftsman who innovated with a traditional form to create something new. The women who chop, vegetables in neat, regular patterns or regular pieces in the kitchen, I think are as creative as the folk singer who sing impromptu repartees in a traditional context. The farmer is creative too, and so is the traditional practitioner of a craft. There are so many examples of this. And this creativity is part of a community's heritage. The moment creativity is limited strictly to individuals, it becomes the unique marker of some people. And this in turn gives rise to a lot of problematic issues. And we will come to that in just a short while. So, what counts as creative today has come to be increasingly decided by utilitarian and commercial perspectives. But not all creative activities undertaken by the folk are actually commercially viable or can be commercially measured. Thus, while some activities and expressions of the folk come to be seen as creative, some others are unfortunately relegated to the background. And Martin Fredrickson has pointed out something very important regarding how utilitarian and commercial perspectives very often work in tandem with colonialism. He suggests that the dichotomy between community ownership and individual authorship, an issue with which we're still grappling, or between collective creativity and private appropriation, is imprinted in a colonial imagination. This is partly the result of colonialism or of colonial heritage. Creativity is often seen today or understood today as a tool to generate new information and products and to fuel economic growth. But I believe it would be more useful to think of creativity as evolving out of specific socio-cultural situations, and therefore it should be understood differently in different contexts. Today, creativity is very often seen as being closely related to innovation. Innovation is probably a more market-friendly concept. But as I said, what about activities that do not aim at economic gain? Economic gain cannot just be about selling a product. When we talk about gain, it must also be about being sensitive to the status it holds in communities and domains. Rustam Barucha has made this point. So what I attempt to do here is to consider the creativity that has continued to exist and continues to be characterized by values that differ from those that we associate with innovation and that we associate with global commerce. One useful way of thinking about creativity, I believe, is to look at Roland Barthes' understanding of the term. I believe there's a need to look at the pre-capitalist origins of creativity and the ways in which it was conceived in earlier times. Roland Barthes has written about this, but I'm not sure of anything, or I'm not aware of anything that is written extensively on the topic. But I think there's a need to look closely at the concept of creativity that emerges in his very important essay, The Death of the Author. We are all familiar with that. That's written in 1967. In many ways, Barth here in this very important essay turns the whole concept of creativity upside down. And I'm not going to the details of his understanding of creativity and why it is that he believes that it is ridiculous to think of the author as a creator. But I'd like to focus on something else. In the course of this essay, Barth presents the idea that this whole concept of creativity as an individual accomplishment is something rather new. Traditionally, in folk societies, creativity has been understood as being community owned instead of being the accomplishment of individuals. Say, think of the traditional priest, the shaman, for instance. The traditional shaman does not, for instance, claim credit for being the creator of a prayer. He or she can go on chanting hymns for days together from an oral scripture that only he or she remembers. But it is the community that owns it. And this individual, the shaman, he or she cannot change anything in these hymns. The freedom of the individual to innovate was limited. He or she was just a passive bearer of tradition. It was only with the rise of industrial capitalism and with the rise of this modern sense of individualism that things began to change and the notion of individual ownership gained prominence. I think this is common experience for all of us. In rural folk communities of India, for instance, no one thinks in terms of owning a folk song or a folk dance. As I said, it is a part of the community's heritage. Now, if creativity is thought of as belonging to individuals instead of communities, it can lead to the growth of inequalities in society. The commercial incentivization of the individual's creativity can create deep chasms in society, both socially and economically. In fact, in many ways, this is what has already happened. But it is a difficult problem, of course, because it presents us with complex ethical choices. See, it's not, there are no easy solutions for this. After all, the individual's creative freedom is also something that has to be cherished. Isn't it a happy proposition for the individual to be able to innovate, to recreate what she or he has received from tradition and give it a new meaning? So, broadly speaking, the whole choice is between, I believe, equality or a community where talent and creativity are collectively owned, or freedom. The choice is between equality or freedom. Should we go for freedom of the individual, which allows him the liberty to innovate and experiment with tradition the way he or she wants to? So, should we prefer a culture where the individual is just a nameless entity, or should we prefer one where some individuals are considered to be creative while others are not? Now, it is important to remember that these questions remain valid only if asked from within a tradition and not from outside it. So, there's also a need to understand the relationship between individual creativity and tradition as dialectical, as both influencing each other. Every individual's honest artistic contribution adds new value to tradition. At the same time, the individual artist or performer only stands to gain from a strong sense of tradition. So creativity is not the privilege of any one class. I'm trying to develop an argument against the appropriation of creativity within the premises of what Bharucha calls the creative economy here. But at the same time, I accept, as Bharucha says, that the commodification or innovation of traditional artifacts through new modes of production and distribution may be necessary to some extent at least, because artisans and craftsmen have to survive in our country after all. So material concerns are important, livelihood issues are important, and there has to be a balance. Having said this, it is interesting to note that presently, in a sense, has been a flow back to a sense of community ownership of traditional cultural expression. So remember, at the beginning, we said that the traditional cultural expressions were owned by communities. In between, there is a stage when the individual gained in prominence. The individual's prominence still remains, but I'm also saying that at the same time, there also seems to be a movement backward, okay, towards community ownership of traditional cultural expression. But this is a very strategic kind of working out. This is not a committed falling back to the world of community bonding, as it were. It's not as if I'm saying that we have gone back to the golden age of the past and we're talking about community ownership of traditional cultural expression. Not that. But the community has become important, and the importance of community has been re-established in new ways. And this is actually merely a convenient falling back upon the idea of community to foster other extra creative ends. Or to put things in perspective, I'll have to talk about globalization. And it is generally agreed that there are two broad areas of life that globalization has impacted: culture and economics. Although it is also possible to argue that they're not really separate. But in any case, I'm more concerned with the cultural aspect of globalization. The fear of globalization is the fear of cultural homogenization. No one wants a uniform society today. A uniform society is one, of course, in which the individual or the community does not have any dignity. So the dread, the fear of cultural homogenization has put communities on the defensive. Everyone wants to be proactive in protecting and guarding their culture. This in turn has paved the way for the instrumentalization of traditional cultural expression. I mean, traditional cultural expressions are no longer important in themselves. They are important today, unfortunately, as symbols of fast disappearing ways of life. The point is, the ways of life cannot be retained in their entirety. So, most of those who are seeking to relieve and reminiscence about the lost ways of life of a culture, they rely on their traditional cultural expression. In the process, traditional cultural expressions themselves remain important not for themselves but for what they stand for. And what do they stand for? They stand very often as markers of ethnicity. Thus, there is this instrumentalization of traditional cultural expressions which leads finally to its decontextualization, to its dehistoricization, and also to what I believe is a process of desacralization. They do not have any sense of respect um, um, for the ethos of that community, whose music you have adopted, or whose traditional cultural expression you are making instrumental use of. So, I repeat, traditional cultural expressions are not important by themselves. They become important for what they stand for. Thus, they are often uprooted from the context in which they properly belong to a completely alien setting. And there are too many casualties of this instrumentalization of culture. And one of these, of course, is aesthetics. Now, aesthetics is, I believe, of course, one of the most abused concepts of our time. No one wants to talk about it. And it is one of the most reviled concepts today. But the fact of the matter is that traditional cultural expression, like folk songs or any other form, have all their own aesthetic codes which fit the context. For instance, a particular folk song has meaning only in a particular season or only in a particular context. It has absolutely no meaning when sung outside it. The members of the community to which a particular traditional cultural expression belongs are well versed with this aesthetic code. Let us not assume that aesthetic codes are universal. Let us not assume that aesthetic codes are things that only um, so-called university educated people have. Aesthetic codes are there even amongst the folk, and it's there very, very strongly. So unfortunately, very often we see that the traditional cultural expressions are removed from the context, and along with this, the aesthetic codes also die a sad death. So today, in the name of political correctness, aesthetic concerns have been pushed to the back burner. They are relegated to the background. We are made to believe that aesthetic codes are unimportant. However, if we do that, I mean, it actually harm the integrity of the folk expression itself because it's integral to its very existence. And let's remember that the problem is not with the aesthetic code per se. There might obviously be opposition to the universal application of the aesthetic codes of one place, for instance, of the West. But this does not take away from the importance of aesthetics itself. Every ethnic community has a very strong understanding of beauty and creativity. We can only appreciate this sense of beauty when we look at communities from within. We should be able to appreciate the codes of cultural appropriateness because very often in folk communities, aesthetics is all about this, cultural appropriateness, which dress to wear in a particular occasion or which sound suits a particular season in a folk song. These are aesthetic questions. And the aesthetic dimension of a folk song is treated as as a syncretic unity of its text and texture, and the triad of text, texture, and context, which was defined by the American folklorist Alan Dundes, of course, connects all the three elements to a whole, and only all three together can bring a folk song or a folk expression to life. Let me make an attempt here to understand, to interpret how traditional cultural expressions have been instrumentalized to serve commercial and sometimes the political interests of ethnic elite, thereby destroying this unity of the text, texture, and context. I'll talk about my own state, Assam, and its most popular festival, Bihu. And my interest in doing this is to show how the traditional notion of creativity, which was context specific, has been violently dissociated from its context. There's a need to address this violence that has become such a marked feature of our social life today. Unfortunately, we love to talk about violence that is dramatic, violence that is visible, but there's a lot of covert violence happening around us that we do not seem to be paying enough attention to. And this is an area where there's a lot of violence happening, actually. As you were aware, the Assamese observe three fertility-related agricultural festivals, they're known as Bihus, which correspond to three seasons of the year. And the etymological root of the word Bihu, there is debate about this, of course, but some people say it has come from the Sanskrit word Viswan, which means equinox. So Bohag Bihu, culturally the most important, ushers in the new year in spring. That is the Bihu of joyous festivity, when people rejoice in the rejuvenation of nature. Bohag Bihu is associated with the spring equinox, and it is generally celebrated in the month of April. Kati Bihu is associated with the autumnal equinox and is generally celebrated in the month of October. Magh Bihu is the harvest festival, and this Bihu is marked by community feasting. Now, out of these three Bihus, Bohag Bihu is the most joyful. It is a celebration of the cyclical patterns of life, cycles of death, and rejuvenation. It reflects the intimate bonds between man and nature, and it is that time of the nature of the year when trees like the coral, like the mango, are in blossom. There are fresh leaves in the trees. The birds sing. We have the fresh uh, showers of the season, and there is fragrance in the air. And in such a situation, songs seem to spring to one's lips almost spontaneously. And this Bihu Geet or Bihu song and Bihu dance is performed during the time of Bohag Bihu. In fact, Bihu songs and dances constitute the most important aspects of the festivities revolving around spring in Assam. And Bihu songs have clearly evolved out of man's proximity with nature. They reveal the community's deep sense of attachment with nature and an acute awareness of the changes brought about by the sea. Bihu songs are accompanied by the musical instruments like dhol, there's tal, there's tepa, there's gogona, different kinds of wind instruments and drums, which occupy a place of pride in the distinctive material culture of Assam. As is usual in such cases, these instruments are made from materials that are locally available. Now, Bihu songs are the most distinctive um, forms, both for their rhythm and also for their lyrical value. Very often, the songs and dances are expression of youth, love and union of young hearts. And during Bihu, the marriageable young men and women, they take an opportunity to choose their life partners. And the joyfulness of the festival is echoed in songs like this. I'd just like to read this one out for you. This is actually from a book been translated, and the book was authored by Professor Nath along with two other co-authors. The lines, just to give you an idea of Bihu songs and what they entail. Bihu this year is so glorious. The Nahar is in bloom. The Nahar is in bloom. Its perfume so rouses my sweetie. She crushes her spinning wheel under her steps. Again and again do we sport, O friends. We sport as long as we live. Do we do so after we die? This is from the book, A Handbook of Folklore Material of Northeast India by Birendranath Datta, Nobin Chandra Sharma, and Proveen Chandra Das. Now, Bihu songs therefore describe the beauty of nature, and the beloved glorifies youth, and they also express frustration and sorrow. And they have been also very creatively used to highlight contemporary issues. I will not be surprised if next year, at around Bihu time, we have plenty of new songs about Corona and all that. It also deals very often with matters of historical importance, like the freedom movement of India. But irrespective of the thematic content, these songs reflect the ecology of Assam, the physical feature of the land, the hills and rivers, especially the Brahmaputra. This is reflected in these songs. And in the Bihu songs, the idea of spring is evoked through the figurative use of different flower trees or different flowers like Nahar, Bokul, Ketki, Togor, and the singing of the cuckoo bird, of course. Now, traditionally, this process of symbolization was deeply connected to the ways of life of people. Thus, this was the creativity that was dependent for its existence on the context. The most important change in Bihu in recent times is that this symbolization has become a mere construct that is completely disconnected from its roots. What I'm talking about is not probably something just limited to Bihu. I mean, true about many of our traditional cultural expressions, but I'm just using this as an example because I know better than better about this than most others. In other words, instead of people, sensing the change of seasons through their close association with nature, it is the tune of a Bihu song that is played in an electronic device today, or the image of a Bihu dancer in a magazine cover that reminds the modern athletes about the onset of Bihu or the change of season. Uh, it, I'm interested in probing the rupture that has come about between this folk art form, both the Bihu songs and dances, and its organic truth. The point is, once we put folk art forms to political use, there is no way of controlling its evolution to appeal to serve the needs of authenticity, as we seem to be doing sometimes. In the age of globalization, as I said a while back, this is a problem that is not unique to Bihu. But what further complicates matters is a tendency to make a spectacle out of its ethnic roots. So at one stage, I mean, there was this economic motive that drove this entire business of traditional cultural expression. Then came ethnicity, and now, of course, there is this tendency to dramatize and to um, make a spectacle out of every existing traditional cultural expression. And the symbolic value of Bihu as a marker of the collective ethnic identity has become so strong that its proponents are forced to freeze its movement in time and space in order to assert its uniqueness as the quote unquote the authentic marker of ethnicness. And in this connection, the question is, therefore, has symbolization led to a disconnect of art from its material form? In earlier times, the bihu that was dance that was performed under fig trees and occasionally under, the mango or the blackberry trees. There are strong reasons behind even the selection of sites. Man Borua has written about this and how even the selection of the site for bihu dances was symbolical of the entire spirit of bihu. So why was the fig tree chosen, for instance? Because the seed of the fig fruit is very small, but in that seed lies the enormous tree of the future. So there is philosophy behind this. Today, of course, Bihu is generally performed on stage or on plain field, and ironically, preferably as far away from trees as possible. Now, this politicization and instrumentalization of Bihu has, it actually started during the colonial era, because in the 19th century, looking at their own festival from the perspective of Europeans, some of the new Assamese elites, they tended to look down upon Bihu as a festival or particularly as a dance form that was vulgar, according to them, and unrefined. And this created a chasm or a cultural lag between the educated elite and the uneducated masses. Meanwhile, some intellectuals realized the importance of this festival as a symbol of nationalism that could tie together the diverse communities of Assam in a bond of brotherhood and camaraderie. One obvious reason why Bihu uh, was important in this regard was the fact that in more or less all over the Northeast, you'll find Bihu-like festivals. These are very, very common. So a compromise was worked out, therefore, between two contrasting attitudes towards Bihu. As a result, there was a modified, more acceptable version of Bihu that evolved in the form of songs and dances that, for instance, were purged of the vulgar movements or words that were considered unacceptable in a civilized community. So, this is a political use of Bihu, and this did the political use of Bihu in arousing Assamese nationalism lead to its abstraction or its separation from the context, its decontextualization? The material cultural aspect of Bihu, as with other cultures, is agreeable to use and appropriation even when we are unaware of its associated social context. Aesthetic evaluation of culture depends on the context as it is carved out of the contextually situated materials and resources. In this context, one is reminded of what Walter Benjamin had said about the changing nature of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And apart from lamenting the loss of aura, Benjamin pointed to the fact, to the liberating aspect of new technology. And he said, the greatest change that has come about in the field of art in the 20th century is its reproducibility. For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction liberates the work of art from its parasitical dependence, he said, on ritual. I'll just quote from Walter Benjamin. He said, to an even greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. From a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, that is politics. So two issues emerge here. the politicization of art, and the myth of authenticity. There's no doubt about the intentions behind the politicization of Bihu were not commercial. The idea was merely to connect with people using Bihu tunes and to associate ethnic nationalism with the month of Bohag or spring. While on the one hand, Bihu became an art form that occupies a distinctive place in Assam's heritage, it also became a tool for demonstrating and staging, in fact, for performing heritage. Indeed, almost all the leading luminaries of the Assam have written about Bohag and I mean that is spring, the spring month, and Bihu. But these have become symbols of Assamese nationalism. Bihu is a participatory festival and it's a spontaneous dance form. Traditionally, in such participatory festivals and rituals, um, there are no audiences. Every single individual of the community would take part in it. But at a point of time in history, the celebration of Bihu shifted from the paddy fields to the courtyards of the landlords and kings. Hemango Biswas, another cultural icon of Assam, he has pointed to this paradigmatic shift of Bihu, which was effected by the unwillingness of the privileged classes to visit the actual site of performance. The performers had to be called to the courtyards of the privileged. And this was the first step towards decontextualization. In fact, it was a decisive moment that would forever alter the course of Bihu. Thus, the Bihu dance changed from being a ritual that everyone took part in to becoming a spectacle or a display. Now, what does the change from a participatory mode of art to a spectacle mean? What are its broader philosophical implications? The compulsion to change, to reduce everything to a spectacle, has had its impact on Bihu too. The very foundation and essence of a folk festival like Bihu was always its participatory mood. Bihu could not ideally have onlookers and spectators. The only subject position from which Bihu could be viewed was from within. There's no other. There is no possibility of viewing Bihu as a spectacle from outside, from without, from the perspective of an outsider. It is identity politics that has introduced this subject-object categorization to Bihu. The moment Bihu came to be posited as a symbol of ethnic nationalism, which it had to be done for historical contingencies, we're not going into that, but the fact of the matter is, once it was done, there was a need to erect fences, to build boundaries, to create the others. Now, when such symbolization was done by sensitive believers of syncretism, people like Bhupen Hazarika, the impact was insignificant or even minimal, non-existent, I would say. But presently, there's a clamor, there's a huge uproar about a return to more, again, authentic forms of Bihu. This return, in turn, can only be symbolical and ornamental because it cannot be possibly the result of an organic return to older ways of life. Further, the advent of new age media and globalization has altered our understanding of the Bihu dance in fundamental ways. Firstly, from being a spontaneous outburst of joy at the rejuvenation of nature of the folk, one group of artists and activists, they have attempted to transform Bihu into a customized, stylized dance form like the classical dances. And supporters of this school have regularly organized workshops where children and adolescents are trained in singing and dancing correctly. And they also sit in judgment in reality shows, assessing the perfection of the steps of the enthusiastic participants. Secondly, there's a trend being initiated of innovating with this folk art form, creating a forced blending of folk tunes that are rendered with electronic instruments. This is at its best music that lacks purpose, music that lacks direction. So while the first group accuses the second of commercializing Bihu, the second makes fun of the first puritanical mindset. The two groups, however, I believe are not really as unlike each other as they may appear at first sight. They both survive by performing heritage, by celebrating culture that is cut off from its organic roots. The challenges that globalization has thrown at our people are many. But it is also interesting to look at the ways in which people have responded to the threat of globalization. As I said, I have chosen the word performance to highlight the idea of superficiality, the idea of hiding beneath the veneer of ethnicity. Today, ethnicity sells like never before. And one of the sure shot ways of striking a chord with the audience is to wear your ethnicity up your sleeve. When people have very little to cling on to, faced by the onslaught of globalization, there's always ethnicity to perform. Uh, to conclude, traditional cultural expressions are based in ritualistic context. The coming of digital technology and the internet have drawn traditional cultural expressions away from their rightful owners in more senses than one. We still haven't even realized its implications till now. These developments have led to an easy access to traditional cultural expression much beyond their places and rituals of their origin, thus giving opportunities of commercialization even to outsiders. Now, strangely, the growing admiration uh, for forced combination or fusion or techno music with traditional musical instruments has significantly altered our understanding of the creativity involved in traditional cultural expression. The spectacular and dramatic moves of the modern fusion artist, that seems a lot more creative, doesn't it, than the understated and modest offerings of the traditional artist. I'll just conclude in this the last paragraph. I'd like to conclude by talking about an award-winning craftsman, artisan of Assam, whose profession is mask making. His name is Hemchandra Goswami, and his creations have made a deep impression everywhere. He's infused fresh life into the tradition of mask making in the small riverine island of Majuli. I've seen Goswami work very, very closely. In fact, we have been lucky to be able to document the entire practice of mask making, thanks to the organization of a 2 week long workshop that we had in our university in 2017. And it was a joy, absolute joy to interact with the artist. His understanding of his craft is amazing, it's remarkable. And one of the most amazing creations for which Goswami is known today is this giant mask of Ravana, uh, whom he colors or whom he colors in blue. And these masks, remember, were originally meant for performance in the satras or the Vaishnavite monastery. However, today they have acquired secular uses. I find it very, very interesting. His this creation of this grand figure of Ravana, much in the manner of Milton's satyr. In other words, Goswami has created a formidable adversary for God. This is a creative exercise that is aesthetically and thematically justified by a solid grasp over tradition. The need to improvise is not primarily external to the craft itself. Thus, there's no violence in this improvisation. There's nothing dramatic about it, nothing superficial about the process. The improvisation has been carried out by someone who is from within the Satra system for aesthetic and for creative reasons. And he did not choose to do this for financial benefits alone. I think this is the difference. The traditional artisan must obviously earn benefits for his craft. This is the only way in which the craft can survive. However, let the craft itself remain primary. All other considerations, political and otherwise, should remain secondary. In Goswami's creative expression, the text, the texture, the context, and aesthetics, they retain their harmony and balance without one outweighing the other. This is what makes it special. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your well articulated and informed lecture. It was indeed very captivating exposition of the entire discourse that you brought to us. You have expanded our understanding of not just traditional cultural expressions, but the concept of creativity as well. Um, Thank you for enlightening us with the unique perspective on folklore from the Assamese perspective, and how there is an inherent connection between the nature, geography, festivities that a culture celebrates and expresses through its folklore. And also, it was really captivating how you expressed and made us understand how folk art form has evolved and the ruptures that have occurred when you talked about Bihu. Thank you so much, sir. We have questions, so if you allow me, I'll just put the
Sure.
questions before you. Thank you, sir.
Please.
Um, First question we have is by Pavitra Kumari. She says, keeping in mind the changing political and social contexts of folk performances, what do you think is the job of the scholar of folklore in the current scenario?
Well, there were no easy answers for these questions. As I say, I mean, it's difficult to say. One has to think about it. But the way I look at it, you see, these changes have come about. These changes are there to stay, and these are not just going to disappear. Even if, but at least let's be conscious of this. Let's be aware of this in the first place. Let's ask questions about this. I'll just give you an example. There is this. I wouldn't like to name the community, but there is this particular traditional cultural expression from Assam, which is connected to a form of religious worship. And people of that community, I have seen they have opposed this, this decontextualization or this desacralization of the folk art form and in the name of research. As researchers, we should also understand and be sympathetic towards people's understanding of their own folk art forms, and we should have respect for those values that they have. That's what I'm arguing for, basically. It's not as if it's there already, I guess, but we need to be even more sensitive about this thing because a point of time has come now when we just cannot do research for its own sake. We have to be very, very critical about what kind of questions we are asking on the field, and we should be very sensitive that we don't hurt people's sentiments and don't tear apart things. Tear things apart, dissect them just for our convenience as researchers. Just because something is convenient for me and I'm a folklorist, I just don't go, collect. We should understand. And as far as possible, try to look at things from, as I said, from within the perspective of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question we have is from Vishant Ramtike. He says, in an age of social media where every day a user creates a new viral video, what chance do traditional cultural expressions stand? Can viral videos be considered as cultural expressions of the modern age?
Yeah, that second question is very, very interesting, actually. And the first question, of course, is that there are, traditional cultural expressions are really in for a hard time, and it's going to be difficult. Going to be difficult for us to survive. I mean, for the traditional cultural expressions to survive. But the internet is here to stay, and that is also a reality that we must accept. Um, but I don't really think that it can qualify as a traditional cultural expression. Definitely, it could be a cultural expression, but definitely not a traditional cultural expression. With time, maybe there'll be changes, and there could be a point of time when these some of these things that are now coming out from the internet could one day be very be counted within folklore itself or be considered a part of folklore itself. But I think that time has not yet come. We still have, living cultures in our country. We still have cultures. Let's not forget that. Let's not think that this digital internet world is all that India is. There are other Indias as well, and that's still very much alive. That India is still very much alive.
Thank you, sir. The next question we have is from Mitali Burman, ma'am. She says, as human race is fast improving in the science and technology, many aspects of natural lives, or rather older way of human lives close to nature, are also changing. Maybe the cultural globalization is becoming an uncontrolled necessity of our times. So, in this context, how far we as human race will be able to preserve the ancient and older versions of the folk arts, which we say as authentic. Do you see that in next 100 years, scientific creativity will completely engulf the older concept of authenticity of arts of any form? Will it be good or bad, or we keep ourselves indifferent or just go with the flow?
Authenticity is already a very, very debated this thing. I don't think we can talk about authenticity in the same manner as we used to say 20 years back or 30 years back. Today we say that we can only have claims to authenticity. You can only make claims of authenticity. There's no real authenticity itself. Because, see, the thing about culture is it's like a flowing river. I think that metaphor is the best possible. I mean, even though it's a very old one, it's the best suited to explain how culture really works. It's a flowing river, and therefore, when you take like Heraclitus said, I mean, you can never walk into the same river twice. You can take a photograph of a river, but by the time you have taken that photograph, the river itself has already changed. So, what is authentic about culture? There's nothing authentic. I mean, it's always constantly changing, and there is no need to check that change. I'm not arguing for what should I say, a non-progressive, non-progressive kind of this thing society. I'm not saying that. All that I'm saying is uh, let this happen naturally, without the intervention of the market, as far as possible, without the intervention of other forces, you know, without the intervention of politics, without the intervention of that's like a dream right now. But let's assume that that could be possible. Maybe culture having its own evolution freely without being shaped by anything else. At least if that could be kept at a minimum. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question we have is from Pooja Sharma. She says, you spoke about collective ownership of traditional cultural expressions. Keeping this in mind, how can we respond in ethical terms to claims of authorship or copyrights on folk materials, given that such material is often borrowed in part or assimilated into authors' own material?
That is true. That is a huge problematic issue, and that is what we have got into in the last, so many years. And we do it all the time, don't we? But unless it is done for commercial benefits, I don't think there's an ethical issue as much. But if it's done for commercial benefits, then I think there's a problem. I think it's more about the intention. One has to look at the intention of the author who is doing that. If you're doing it, if you're using anything folk to earn profit for yourself, then of course it's bad. I mean, without having the consent of the community consent. A second point, of course, is what I said in response to the first question. I think about the sensitivity of the researcher. We also have to be sensitive to local consent. If the community doesn't want that to happen, you shouldn't do it. But still, the question of intention, I think, remains of paramount importance. I mean, the intention of the author.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Rashmi Bhura, and she asks, how far do we need to decolonize our literary and critical approach to folklore studies?
Hugely, I think, like I just hinted at it. Unfortunately, I didn't have time. I also haven't been able to really prepare myself to speak on that. But I think, just what I hinted, if you remember, in the course of my talk, I did say that, this whole idea of the difference between community authorship, ownership, and individual authorship is also a part of the colonial this thing construct. Earlier in our kind of societies, we probably did not have that. There are a lot of things that we need to rethink. There's no doubt about it. And there's a lot of unlearning that we still have to do.
Yes, thank you. Next question is from Dr. Jyotirmoy Pradhani. He asks, can a folk festival be ever restricted to its original space and hold it back from the urban spaces? Would not the conservationists paradoxically, by default, engage in codifying the folk with the intention to preserve its authenticity?
That's true. That is what I guess is happening all the time, and we can't possibly uh, restrict anything. I mean, I'm not talking about restricting something would be against going against the ethos of culture itself, I guess. But um, um, let the people themselves decide. I'd say let the people decide.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Arunima Goswami wants to ask if the concept of authenticity for an art form differs from context to context or from time to time.
That's not exactly clear to me how. But if I think part of that question I have already answered. I mean, about authenticity, but art specific, I don't think so. I don't think the whole idea, the whole concept of authenticity itself has come under the scanner today. No one thinks of, as I said, of authenticity in the same manner as they did earlier. What is authenticity after all? What is authentic? What is authentic for you will not be authentic for me today. I mean, you can go on arguing for our entire lives about what you consider to be authentic and what I consider to be authentic. So, as I said, there can only be claims to authenticity probably today. But yeah, so that will be context specific. That will keep on changing from time to time.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Ruchi Rana. She says, as you just mentioned now about the importance of ethical positioning of field workers while engaging with the community in its own natural habitat, how one needs to change the self and being itself before entering the field to study indigenous community and native people. She says, I'm very keen to know from you, as a budding folklorist, how can we individually or as collective formulate field methodologies to help young researchers working in this direction?
Now, that's a very important question, but I don't really know if I would be able to answer that adequately. But yes, I think the primary thing for all of us to remember. I mean, don't say that it's just about budding folklorists and old folklorists. I mean, it's true for everyone. It's true for everyone that we all have to be uh, honest. I mean, that honesty will, if it's there, we will be able to connect with the people. And if it's not there, if you're not sensitive, if we do not have a sense of empathy, it's a, it's not something that can be learned from books. I guess that has to be cultivated individually. I think this is very important. We do read books maybe, but sometimes we fail to internalize what's there. I think that's a huge problem with most of us. Most of us are far removed from the world of the ideas that are there in the books that we read. Let's have that internalize that sense of empathy for others. Once that happens, do unto others as you would do to yourself. That kind of an attitude. If you can really do that, I mean, rest of all would fall in line automatically, I guess. And you, as a researcher in the field, would be the best judge of what's happening. Just be true to your conscience, and you know for sure. I'm sure you know what would be the right thing to say, what would be the right thing to do at the right moment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The chat box is filled with messages of appreciation and gratitude, which I will not be reading, but I would really like to thank you on behalf of the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies and the audience, because you can't, I mean, I can't read the messages, but I would really would want to thank you. Uh, uh,
Thank you so much, Ankita. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
sir.
thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for your patient listening. I mean, um, okay. I mean, the discussions can always go on
Yes, sir.
even after. Yeah.
Yes, sir. It was a privilege, sir. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar.
Thank you.
Uh, but Nayak, sir, should I?
Yes, yes, it is under your control only.
Okay, sir. So, last but not least, I would thank the department and Professor Patnaik for giving me this opportunity and giving all of us this opportunity to be a part of such an enlightening webinar. And we know the kind of pain you take, sir. We can't thank you enough. But again, thank you so much. Thank you for being there for each one of
Thank you.
us.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
sir. Thank you, Professor Nath.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Venkat sir, should we just Venkat sir?
Yeah, I can close it now.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Venkat sir. Thanks for being